genotoxical damage.
The Monsanto papers showed us all those things.
Is all of this necessary?
You're called living with mom and taking responsibility.
The world's your oyster. What we got to lose?
I haven't been on a date since December?
Causes genotoxical damage.
The Monsanto papers showed us all those things.
Is all of this necessary?
You're called living with mom and taking responsibility.
The world's your oyster. What we got to lose?
I haven't been on a date since
Yeah, exactly. Okay, you all good, Judah? Okay. Okay, everybody, let's get ourselves started here. We'll be able to, once we're done this session, we'll be able to go outside and so our dinner will be at 5 is when it's supposed to be roughly ready, roughly. Don't quote me on that. But you'll be able to enjoy everybody, like hanging out with everybody and asking more questions and stuff then. Okay, so we're all set. So let's get this started then. Our final session of the day is about how to use existing IP to break into the industry. So Bruno is going to take us through this. He can introduce himself and all of that, and he's got a PowerPoint which we'll go through some stuff, and then has a couple videos to show as well. And I think it's going to be something very interesting, something that you might not have thought about, using existing things to your royalty-free stuff and all that, the stuff that you can actually use. So, as I'll pass this over to Bruno, and he can get started.
Okay, so thank you to the organizers of the event. Thank you for all of you who are here. This is just for, I didn't hear a reverb and just wanted to check that everything was working. So, a little bit about myself. I was a corporate lawyer for 13 years, the usual trajectory for a filmmaker, then switched to film. Currently I teach. I spend a lot of time teaching at Oakville University and Toronto Film School, in addition to other places. And I really wanted to, all my classes are the most exciting ones. They talk about intellectual property, film finance, and that kind of stuff that really drives people crazy about film. But anyway, this lecture is going to be about how to use IP to break into the industry, how to add value to your specific projects when you're starting out. And the examples I'm going to try to focus on are examples of people that actually use this knowledge of IP in their initial project. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is that we are living in an unprecedented time of an overcrowded marketplace, a time in which you have more content being created than ever before. That would be the second slide here, the second bullet point. Options for end consumers. We're all aware of 100 different streaming services that are available. We're also aware Technology has advanced to a degree that we can all get our work, whether it's a screenplay, whether it's a specific project, in the hands of these gatekeepers. But the flip side to that is that everyone can get their work in the hands of these specific gatekeepers. So how do you adapt to that new reality? And basically, what we're going to try to keep in mind as we go through the lecture is the fact that there are changes in viewing patterns, that people are adapting the way they consume specific forms of media. There's a very interesting study by Nielsen indicating that 48%, I think, of people admit to always using a second screen or very often using a second screen, which means there's a diminished level of engagement. And what we're going to try to, the preface of this lecture is really trying to establish that when we're talking about breaking into the industry, we need to take into consideration the reality we live in. We need to take into consideration that when you're trying to reach out to a gatekeeper, he, she, or they have, 500 emails that they received in the past hour, and that when you're looking at what the end consumer is going to want to do, he, she, or they have a plethora of options that they can consume that don't just end with film, that end with all the different types of media. So that's sort of the ground we're working with. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. Maximizing the quality of your project and maximizing the appeal of your project. These should be synonymous. Obviously, a good project should appeal to the audience, but we all know there's more than that, particularly given the peculiarities of the level of engagement that we've already discussed. You need to do something that actually hooks the audience in. And I believe that, of course, you need to know how to shoot, you need to know how to write a screenplay, you need to know how to market your piece, but there's a very specific aspect of IP, and I still haven't defined what IP is, but I promise I will do so shortly. Better understanding of IP is a fantastic way to achieve that objective. So could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. First, a disclaimer, because as a lawyer, I had to include a disclaimer at some point. We are going to be talking in theory about these subjects, which is to say, you should perform a thorough legal analysis of any actual case that you're trying to perform. We're having a talk as filmmakers. We're having to talk about the general concepts that can help with this specific strategy. And there are three key approaches that we're going to discuss during this class, and we're jumping into the core of what I wanted to discuss. Weaving factual elements into your fictional story, public domain stories and characters, and fair use or fair dealing. So regarding the first one, perfect timing. How does this relate to IP? Because intellectual property is the idea of an intangible asset. It's something that's created from the human intellect. There are different types of intellectual properties, and the one that's going to be mainly important for us is something called copyright, which everyone has heard of, but some people might refer to it interchangeably with patents, with trademarks, and we're going to try to specify what that is. Intellectual property, when referring to artistic works, if we're talking about films, novels, paintings, or anything of that nature, that all falls under copyright. Copyright is the branch of intellectual property that regulates creative works. And copyright is very rigid. When we talk about these different forms of intellectual property, copyright really gives the copyright holder, the owner of the copyright, near complete control over his, her, or their creation. Basically, no one can do anything. That's not completely true. As a lawyer, you should understand that everything I say here comes with a caveat saying there's a 1% exception. But in broad terms, the holder of the copyright has complete control over his, her, or their work. No one can do anything without the authorization from the holder of the copyright. However, I did say that copyright refers to artistic works, which means facts and events, things that actually happened, are not protected by copyright because they are not artistic works. They are things that actually happened, which means when you combine the absence of copyright with the principle of freedom of speech, with the principle of free speech, what we have is that things that actually happen can be freely referenced in your work. So that's how I sort of fit this into this story. Could we go to the next slide, please? Cool. So let's talk about benefits. What are the benefits of weaving factual elements into your story? The first point I wanted to make. First, let's establish the terrain we're in. I am not talking about biopics, although that's a fantastic genre that you can explore in different ways. I am talking about having a fictional story that you've included factual elements to enrich either its appeal or its overall quality, and that's what we're going to try to address. The first sub-benefit of this specific category is economy. I read a lot of screenplays by early filmmakers, early stage filmmakers, and probably the main overall issue is excessive exposition, complicated setups. They're not getting to the point. That doesn't mean your screenplay should rush to get to the central conflict, but it does mean that you need to strike a very delicate pace. And that's hard to do, particularly when you're trying to create a rich story with different characters, particularly when you're trying to explain the motivations of the character that you spent months, years developing in your mind. One pretty efficient way to do that is to rely on information the audience already has, not having to explain things to the audience. And that's where the factual elements come in. We're going to talk about very rudimentary examples and then slightly more complex examples, but if you offer the audience something they already know in order to allow for this explanation to take place, your script will be streamlined, and therefore you will deliver on the emotion. Information is the primary enemy of emotion, and you want to avoid giving too much information, particularly if it isn't necessary to the main comprehension of the story. So let's start, and by the way, my examples will sometimes be of older films, but I'm trying to focus on films that everybody watched, so I wouldn't have to stop the presentation every 30 seconds to play a clip. So let's talk about Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, this is a film that has a lot of public domain elements. The Lost Ark itself, the staff of Ra, the lost city that they're trying to find. All those are elements in the public domain. But I want to talk about a very simple element. If you remember the film, and I hope you all do, it's quite serious if you don't. But if the beginning of the film, we have the little adventure with Indiana Jones, then he's back at his university teaching a class, and then he's taken away by Army intelligence officers that are going to sort of explain the plot of the film to him, what is going to happen with the Lost Ark, why they need him, and so on and so forth. And there's a key word that they present, and remember, this is the first very rudimentary example. They say, the Nazi are after the Lost Ark. Now, why is that so efficient? Because you don't need to explain who the Nazi are. Not only that, but you don't need to explain why it's bad that the Nazi get the Lost Ark. We don't know the details, but we immediately know that's bad. We immediately know that the people opposing the Nazi are the good guys. And you have a number of other ancillary benefits. You can reference the Gestapo and not have to explain what the Gestapo is. You can later have a reference to a specific occupation and be able to rely on that. You know the audience will already understand why not only are they the bad guys, but why it's essential that Indiana Jones stop him. You don't need to give the motivation. You don't need to explain that Indiana Jones' father had something against the Nazi. We all have something against the Nazi, and therefore that's why they need to stop the Nazi. And that might sound silly, and again, extremely rudimentary example, but to my point, it saves you time. It saves information that you need to deliver. The second example, a little bit more complex, and we're going to increase the level of complexity. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the Quentin Tarantino film. The moment you hear Charles Manson, you understand who the bad guy is. And in a film like that, that's essential. That's a film that relies on its perfectly paced rhythm. That's a film that can't give you too much information because you're there for the ride. You're there to see, Brad Pitt being cool, Leonardo DiCaprio being cool, everybody else in the film being cool as well. And you can't get bogged down by the level of information that's being conveyed. But by putting Charles Manson in the film and by putting Sharon Tate in the film, we all, because we know these factual elements, we all understand where the story's going. We all understand what the risks are. And there's an added benefit. The why and the how no longer need to be answered. If I were writing a film about a horrible person, a serial killer, I'd have to give the audience motivation. When we're talking about fictional stories, we all need to understand how and why. We need to understand why this person is committing these horrible acts. I would need to understand how he managed to convince his acolytes, his followers, to come in on that. I would have to understand how he got that huge farm that they're all living in. I would have to understand all these elements because as an audience member, I'm not just going to buy this information that you're telling me that this guy managed to convince 30, 40 people to follow him, that he's going to invade this house that's, they're not going to have a security system. But because I'm talking about actual events, people buy the story because they understand that this actually happened. So the audience, and this isn't a thought process that we go through or that the audience goes through, but we give the filmmaker a pass. We say, I know that happened. I don't need you to explain why those acolytes ended up at that house, why those followers ended up at that house, because I know that actually happened. So I no longer need to provide the why and the how. And if I were telling you a fictional story about a man who convinced a number of followers to engage in horrific crimes, I would have to explain how he did that. I would have to explain what he managed, what techniques he used. I would have to explain how he reached the point in both he had the persuasiveness to do that, but also how he reached that inclination, how he reached that level of interest. I no longer need to do all that when I rely on something that actually happens. And I'm sure you've all felt that listening to stories. If you know it actually happened, you're like, cool, I'll buy that because I know it actually happened. Still, we're going to try to get a little bit more complex. Castaway. If you remember that film, one of the initial scenes is Tom Hanks as a FedEx executive in charge of logistics. Now, the reason I wanted this example is it talks about character development. Any of you who might be writers have discussed and read and learned about character development endlessly. We have long conversations about how to include that seamlessly into the screenplay, and this is actually a fantastic way to do so. They just told you, this is the guy in charge of logistics for FedEx. Now, please keep in mind, this is a 20-whatever-year-old film, so at the time we didn't have Amazon. The idea of delivery on time was synonymous with FedEx. So by saying this is the person who deals with that, this is the person who handles all that, they were giving us so much information about that character that we wouldn't otherwise be able to tell in a film that has to get to the island rather quickly, or else we're going to be bogged down by the story. What I need to know is he's in love with Helen Hunt, and he's the head of logistics of FedEx. You will be able to extrapolate everything else you need to know from this character. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. This was sort of a cheat on my part, because actually we're not talking about factual events, we're talking about trademark, but this was my way to sort of include trademark into our conversations. Earlier I said intellectual property is the existence of an intangible property created by the human intellect. And I said that copyright refers to works of art. Trademark is synonymous with brands. Basically, the way you protect brands isn't through copyright, it is through trademark. And if copyright is extremely rigid, am I out of the shot? No. If copyright is extremely rigid, trademark isn't. Trademark, there's a common misconception that you can't use trademarks. That is not really true. And as always, there are 100 exceptions to what I'm about to say, but in theory, if you're not tarnishing a brand or you're not implying endorsement by a brand, you can use that specific trademark. That's something you're allowed to do. And that can be tricky. There have been arguments that if a bad guy is using an iPhone, then you're tarnishing the brand, that if you change the interface of a specific electronic product, you're tarnishing it because you're creating confusion on how it works. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that it's simple, but it is something you can explore. And in this example, it tells us so much about the character in maybe a 20-second scene. You see the rush of the FedEx employees trying to deliver the product. You see that he's coordinating everything. He has a time watch in his hands, and he's timing everybody. And this is a guy who lives by schedules. He lives by order. He needs order to survive. And I get all that without having to say a single word of dialogue, just dynamic images on set. And I now haven't had to spend, 20 pages of my script making the audience understand who this character is. I've immediately filled them in on who this character is. And it can also work very efficiently in terms of tone of the film. Forrest Gump, a film I'm assuming everybody has watched, in the very early stages of the film, we know that this character is going to go off and change the course of the world. But if you present that later in the film, there's an incredulity in the part of the audience. We haven't seen that happen, and that's going to seem fake. They include a short little scene in which a child, the child character, Forrest Gump, is at his mother's inn, and he happens to go to the room of one of the guests, and he teaches this guest, who we discover is Elvis Presley, how to do a specific dance. Now, the reason that scene's so impactful is there's virtually no dialogue. All we see is the silhouette of Elvis Presley. But we now understand that throughout this story, we're going to see this young boy influencing history. And later on, as a grown person, he's going to influence history. I've set the tone. I've told the audience what they can expect. I haven't told them that the whole film is going to be about that, but I've introduced a scene that now the audience, and again, an extremely economical scene. I haven't had to, explain to them who Elvis Presley is, why this dance is important, why all these other elements come into play. I've just shown them a 5-second scene, and by doing so, I've established the core of my film. I've established the pace of my film. I've established the rhythm of my film. Guys, I know this is an arid subject matter. Everybody following? Any questions here? Cool. Benefits, emotional connection. Emotion requires empathy. We have a difficulty of feeling an emotion if we don't have a degree of empathy for the situation. And creating this emotional content, creating this emotional connection over a couple of pages of a script or a few minutes of the film is extremely difficult. In long-running series, that's easier. I was rewatching The Office when Michael Scott left. I'm going to cry. But in a shorter form, it's very hard to achieve that level of emotional connection. Throughout this lecture, I'm mainly going to mention films that actually exist, but this is an example I want to use because it was an issue. A young filmmaker brought a script, and we were discussing it in an academic setting, and he wanted to write a script about a musical idol who had passed away and how this affected the life of his young character, and there was going to be a plot developing as a result of that, but that was not technically the inciting incident, but that was an initial launch point for the story. And I told him, yeah, you can create a fictional musical idol, that's fine, but you're going to have to explain to the audience who this musical idol is, why your character cares about this person, and so on and so forth. Or you can have a 17-year-old coming into New York by bus in December 1980. This young boy is walking down the street excited. He has a white-covered album under his arm. He's making his way uptown. He reaches 77th Street. There's a group of fans. We still don't know exactly who is there, but we start seeing like signage of Beatles, John Lennon, and he's standing right in front of the Dakota Building. And he stays there for hours. And late at night, 11 o'clock, nearly midnight, a limo pulls up. And we see the excitement on this character's face when John Lennon steps out. This is what he's waited for his whole life. He's the biggest Beatle fan, the biggest John Lennon fan who's ever lived. And he, clenches the record under his arm, and he prepares to cross the street. And as he puts his foot onto the pavement, we hear 5 shots being fired, and John Lennon has tragically, and I say this earnestly, has tragically been killed. And we see the reaction in our character's face. Now, why is that so? My story isn't good, but why is that so much better than the alternative? You don't need to explain why this is traumatic. You don't need to explain why this is truly tragic in realistic terms. This is something that actually happened, and the audience understands the gravitas of that situation. More so, the audience has an emotional connection to this. They are fans of the Beatles. They are fans of John Lennon. If they're not fans of the Beatles, not fans of John Lennon, they have friends, they have family, they have somebody in their life who is a fan of that. And if John Lennon is the right example for you, by all means, pick someone else. But rely on that emotional content. Maybe somebody's such a big fan that they know that John Lennon was going home to kiss his son, which adds a whole other emotional layer to that scene. Maybe somebody was around and remembers hearing that on television or on the radio. Maybe somebody heard that from an older sibling, from a parent, about what happened that specific day, which means you've just assigned all this emotional value to a scene, relying on something that actually happened. Now, can a talented writer achieve that by writing a beautiful script? Of course you can. But it's almost impossible in a very short amount of time because, again, it connects to the economy we discussed in the last slide to do so in 5 pages because you're either going to be dumping information or it's going to be so subtle that the majority of the audience will miss the mark. And by relying on something the audience understands, you're automatically getting their attention and assigning this emotional content. All clear? Cool. Last but not least, you can manipulate expectations, and you can do that in several ways. So you can certainly do it, like Titanic. We know there is going to be a tragedy. The film is called Titanic. We all know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen to Jack and Rose. We don't know if, the lifeboat or the plank is going to fit 2 people or not, but we do know that something tragic is going to happen to these 2 lovers that have just met. And I'm going to work with that. I don't need to explain to the audience. I don't need to have a flash forward scene in the beginning of the film saying something's going to happen to the ship because the audience already knows that because I've set the story in the Titanic. I could have referred to Pearl Harbor, the movie. I could have referred to a number of other examples that rely on the same thing. Now, you can lean in on these expectations, but you can also do something more subtle. You can play on the expectations of characters. This is a lesser-known film, but still very well-known, I'm assuming for many of you, 6 Degrees of Separation. A young Will Smith arrives at the house of Donald Sutherland and Stockard Channing, and he pretends to be Sidney Poitier's son in the story. It's a lie in the story. He is not. But the fact that he tells this lie, we are relying on the expectations we have of what their reaction and what his line mean because we know what that means in the real world. So you're still playing with the expectations of the audience. You're doing it in a much more subtle way, in a developmental way, but you're still achieving the same results. And last but not least, Inglourious Basterds. I could have used Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but Inglourious Basterds is better first because it came first, and therefore when you're watching the film, the entire film, it has a heightened sense of reality. And of course it's fictional in its majority, but it seems tethered to reality. You have an idea, listen, of course this exact character that Brad Pitt is playing didn't exist, but I get that it's heightened, but it's still reality. So we're moving towards something that actually happened in World War II. And then in the final scene, and this is going to be a spoiler, but I'm assuming everyone here has seen the film, you're going to completely subvert that. And that's an effect you can only get if you had told the audience with a flash-forward scene in the beginning, this is going to happen, and then you flip the script on them. No, but that's a cheap trick, because you literally told me what was going to happen, and now you're telling me the opposite, which means you're actually tricking me. If I'm relying on what you already know, and I actually told you this isn't reality because I had Mike Myers playing, the general, and I had Brad Pitt, clearly I showed you this was a heightened reality, and you still didn't realize that I was going to change history, that's where the magic comes in, and that's where you can play around with these expectations in a way that enriches your film, again, relying on something that is free, that is completely available to you. The way you're going to do, and, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, and so on and so forth. You can get very ridiculous with these, and not that the film is ridiculous, but the premise is ridiculous. The film is fine, but you can play around with something that is very tragic, Titanic, very subtle and indicative of the problems of our society, something that is dealing with a tragic subject matter, but doing so in a subversive way, or you can be completely ridiculous, and again, good ridiculous, not criticizing the film at all, in a Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter kind of way. Any questions so far? Cool. Could we go to the next slide, please? Everything I've talked about so far hinges on one requirement: texture. You need to feel like you're actually in that location, and you can only achieve that with one thing, which is copious amounts of research. That will give you the feel, the appearance, the consistency that reality would have in the factual world. Now, what do I mean by research? A lot of times students or young filmmakers come to me and say, well, yeah, I've read this book. I mean the most thorough research you can think of. If your story takes place in a little town in the south of England, you go on Google Street View, you read about the history of that town, join a town hall meeting, reach out on social media to somebody that lives on that town, order from a local store and ask to have a call with the store owner or somebody working there. Get as much nuance as you can. That will provide everything that we've discussed. It will just provide specificity, purpose, realism, in a way that would be very difficult to rival with an independent creation. And an example of that I want to use is a film called Summer of Sam. It's a Spike Lee film, a very interesting film. It actually doesn't talk about, but at the same time it does, the serial killer Son of Sam. The film is not about the serial killer. It's not a whodunit. It's not an investigative piece. What they are doing is setting the stage. What Spike Lee, a genius filmmaker, does is establish this is the heightened sense of reality that people were experiencing. Everybody was afraid. Everybody was horrified. And I'm going to create the world that actually existed in that summer, one of the hottest summers ever in New York, in which a serial killer was on the loose. And then I'm going to tell a story that has nothing to do with that. It's affected by that real life story, so it feels real because it is real. And again, we all believe it because it is real. It has all the other benefits we've discussed before. But now I'm going to set this stage of purpose, of realism, when somebody doesn't want to leave the house because they're afraid of the Son of Sam killer. That feels real. You don't need to explain to me why that happened, because if I do my research, I will see how it happened. Because when Spike Lee researched it, he knew that on the news that specific day, the news anchor said, you should stay home. Anyone in New York should stay home. And now you can play that on within your film, and you can create depth to that specific scene. Even if ultimately and intentionally subverted. Everybody watched Queen's Gambit on Netflix. That story, the creators of the original book and of later on in the series studied the life of Bobby Fischer. Now, obviously, the character in Queen's Gambit is not Bobby Fischer by any stretch of the imagination, and there are numerous nuances and changes that resulted from this change in the story. But they dissected the life of Bobby Fischer, and a number of the events that are taking place in that film are events that happen in the life of Bobby Fischer. Now, once you've changed the character, you then make the changes to the reality you saw, but you still achieve the specificity, the purpose that would be very hard to do if you're working from a completely theoretical point of view. And the last benefit is additional ideas. While you're doing research, I assure you, more ideas will come up, more ways to explore a scene, a way to heighten a scene. And a great example of that is in the phenomenally well-written West Wing TV show by Aaron Sorkin. In the very first episode, he had a research team, and they were setting up a scene in which the president, played by Martin Sheen, was going to leave a specific event, go to the car, and then the rest of the team was going to arrive and join him in the car. And one of their researchers says that can't happen. Once the POTUS goes into the car, the motorcade leaves, no matter what's going on, because obviously there's a security concern, and therefore we're going to take off regardless of what happened. That led to Aaron Sorkin writing a 2-episode arc in which the whole team is in the middle of some rural area, and I'm going to mention the names of the characters, not the actors, which is very impolite, but Josh Lyman, Donna Moss, and Toby Ziegler get left behind because the motorcade needs to leave as soon as the president goes in, and they're in the middle of some farm wherever. That was an additional idea that came out of the research, and that enriches your story. And even that had specificity. You had communications between the Secret Service. You had how that had actually happened in the past. And all that adds depth to your story, in addition to the other benefits, in addition to economy, in addition to subverting, to playing with expectations, in addition to the emotional connection. So all these are elements to be considered. Next slide. Public domain fictional stories. So now we're moving to the second one. We talked about weaving factual elements into your screenplay, and now we're going to talk about copyright protection and public domain. Copyright protection was never meant, as indicated discreetly on the slide, was never meant to last forever. The whole concept of copyright was we want creators, we want artists to be able to make money off of their work. But at some point, society, the balance of wanting them to make money off their work and the benefit that that would bring to society to be able to use that work freely, it sort of changes the equilibrium of that specific transaction, and you want society to be able to use something freely. So for the most part, copyright has always had a limitation in time. Copyright doesn't last forever. If you create a specific work, you can exploit it for an amount of time that you will be able to make money off it. Your heirs will be able to make money off it for a while, but after that, it will go into what is called the public domain, which means it's a free-for-all. You can use whatever you want that is in the public domain. There's a few observations that I'll make in a bit, but for the most part, that's the case. In Canada, the general rule, again, several exceptions, but life of the author, life of the creator, plus 50 years. In the US, it's life of the author plus 70 years, or if it's a work for hire, 95 years after publication. But basically, there's a very strict amount of time. Which means classical literature, folklore, mythology, all these are realms you can explore, and you can enrich your story by adding these elements. One of a script I sold last year relied on a folkloric image of, I'm Latinx, originally from Brazil, folkloric image of Brazilian culture, and that helped the process, that helped specificity, and helped all the other elements. And these are things that you can absolutely do. Hundreds of successful projects based on public domain works, including many Disney animated classics, every Shakespeare adaptation, adaptations of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Lewis Carroll's Alice Adventures in Wonderland, and the list goes on. All this material is available to be used. We'll talk about a few caveats to that statement, but in general, that is true. One point I want to make, there's a difference between source material and new creation. Let me be clear, the new creations are not in the public domain. The Disney animated films are not in the public domain. The source material of that film is in the public domain, and that will be very important, and I'll just address that now. Well, we'll address it in the next slide, if you don't mind. Thank you. And today, as the main example I wanted to discuss in this section, I wanted to talk about Snow White and the Huntsman, the Charlize Theron, Kristen Stewart, Chris Hemsworth film from circa 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago. Why did I want to use this script as an example? First, it was extremely successful. The spec script was sold for a reported $3.2 million. So that was the sale of the script alone was $3.2 million. The film made nearly $400 million at the global box office. The second reason I wanted to do this, chose this example, is it was written by an unproduced screenwriter. Evan Daughtry, who wrote this screenplay, hadn't made a single film when he sold the script for $3.2 million. And since we're talking about breaking into the industry, I wanted an example that highlighted a early stage filmmaker, somebody who was coming in and not a super established one. We'll talk about other examples, who went on to have a prolific career. I also wanted it to be a screenwriter that wasn't a one-hit wonder. I wanted somebody who didn't have like a fun little gimmick that he, she, or they managed to sell one script. Since then, he's written one of the Divergent films. He's written the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle films. Killing Season, which is the hunting thriller with Robert De Niro and John Travolta. So he's had a prolific career since, and those are the elements that basically indicated that this was the right case study, because again, very successful, unproduced screenwriter, and somebody who had the goods to back it up later. He could, handle other projects as they came along. So if we could go to the next one. He relied, why was it a success? And now we're gonna sort of break that down. He relied on public domain elements. What do I mean by that? I just explained to you that a work goes into the public domain. So it doesn't mean that the whole work goes into the public domain. Yes, but there's something called incremental additions of originality in the derivative work. So let's sort of break that down. When Disney decides to make the animated Snow White classic that we all know from 1937, they created new things. They added to the original Brothers Grimm story from 1812. They didn't just copy that original story. And this is a hugely complicated field, but if we were to boil it down to something we can address in this lecture, anything that's substantial that they added to the film, to the story, becomes protected by copyright. And an example of that is the name of the characters called in this project Seven Dwarfs. Those characters didn't have a name in the original Brothers Grimm story. They were given names in a 1912 Broadway presentation, and then Walt Disney gave them a new set of names in the 1937 film. So that becomes a protected element. The elements of the original story, the magic mirror, the poisoned apple, the glass coffin, the evil queen, and a number of others, those still remain in the public domain. But the issues that are added to later projects become protected by copyright. So when we talk about Frankenstein, we talked about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein a moment ago. Is that in the public domain? 100%. If you want to do a thorough film version reproducing Mary Shelley's beautiful work, you can. But the monster that we know as Frankenstein's monster visually, that is a representation created by the Universal films, early mid 20th century. And that is still something that can be protected by copyright. So Evan, the screenwriter of Snow White and the Huntsman, knew how to sort of sidestep those risks. He relied on elements that were still in the public domain and wrote a script that for the most part was completely available because it had only relied on public domain issues and his own independent creations. All clear so far? We're getting cool. But he provided a new perspective, and this is very important. Now, you can create work that is, a copy of the, you can do a beautiful rendition of Hamlet or anything else, and that might be all you're going, not all you're going for because that seems depreciative, but that might be your objective. And congratulations, that's extremely difficult to do and highly entertaining and very valuable in terms of entertainment. But if we're talking about breaking into the industry, it needs to be more than that because Kenneth Branagh is doing Shakespeare, and therefore it becomes hard to compete with that. So when you provide a new perspective, that sort of changes the whole thing. If you can take that story and say, I think what's wrong with this, I don't even want to say wrong, but what I think is missing from this story is this different perspective. And then I'm retelling the story in the public domain with a new perspective. Now that's interesting. That's something that can attract attention because, if we could go to the next slide, thank you so much. And now we're going to talk about the benefits of it. And this is a phrase I use quite a bit and that I really like. It offers audience the comfort of familiarity and the excitement of discovery, which is really what buyers are looking for. You want something that has a built-in knowledge because as we discussed in the very beginning of this class, of this lecture, I guess master class, so I'm still good. But people have a diminished level of engagement right now. I know that when I'm watching something on Netflix, it's different than when I was at a theater, or even less time ago when I would buy something on iTunes. There was a level of commitment. We're sitting down to watch something. Now audience entertainment has become, or there is sadly a sense that it is disposable. And as a result, you want something that hooks people in, that gives them a little bit of information about the world you're presenting to them so that they already feel like they understand what they're stepping into. Now, somebody can create a fantastic show like Severance that's out. Ben Stiller co-created the show. Phenomenal work, completely innovative world, mind-boggling. But you need to have, for that to be done independently or without a huge star attached to it is extremely difficult. So if you can rely on this comfort of familiarity and excitement of discovery, that's what everybody is looking for. Global appeal. These stories are known around the world. Now, that is, to a degree, an overstatement, but only by a bit. The majority of the world is familiar with these stories, and therefore they understand what you're pitching them. They understand the information that's being conveyed to them. And you might think that that only applies to blockbusters. That only applies to, $100 million films starring Charlize Theron. That only applies to Chris Hemsworth films, Kristen Stewart films. But no, those of you who are independent filmmakers here have tried to raise money at film markets. You've tried to do pre-sales. You've tried to do, you've negotiated at AFM. You've negotiated at EFM. You've done the market circuit, and you might be pitching somebody that has a different background than you, that doesn't know the nuances of a specific cultural element that you're trying to pitch. By relying on the general basis of a story that we're all somewhat familiar with, we might not have visited that story recently, we might not be Shakespeare connoisseurs, but we know the general outline. That makes it easier to communicate, it makes it easier to pitch, and again, it gives you this global appeal. I don't, and I want to be very clear, I don't mean global appeal, you're going to make $400 million at the box office. But yes, you're trying to pitch your film to, HBO in a couple of territories in Eastern Europe. If you're talking about Snow White, cool, I know where you're starting from. Now we have a common ground. Now tell me the rest of your pitch quickly. But at least we have the common ground. If I'm telling you a completely independent story that I need to create from scratch, that person is, unless you have a relationship with that buyer, that person is already distracted by second 20. And therefore, if you haven't gotten to the goods yet, that's going to hurt your chances at selling that specific project. That sort of connects to easier to pitch premise. That applies internationally, but also domestically, locally. The narrative begins from a place of deeper engagement, not only in terms of information, but we are tickled, we are entertained by stories that we've heard all our lives. They pull at our heartstrings in a different way. Even if you're not the biggest Snow White fan, you've seen the Snow White animated films at some point in your life, or somebody that you care about has watched that film, and therefore there is an emotional connection there that you can tap into while you're pitching. There's a specific scene you can reference, and you can't do that completely with an independent creation. Let me be clear, you can be as creative as you would be with a completely original piece, but that creativity is going to be shown in the variances, in the departures from the original story, and not at its core. But again, it becomes extremely valuable. Audience is susceptible to noticing details that would otherwise be missed. We are an audience with, again, limited engagement, but if you're diverging from an original story they know, most likely they're going to notice, the bad guy who now is a good guy, and they're going to notice little signs of that as the story develops, because now they're paying attention to a story they already know the general outline of, which means any little variance calls on their attention, demands their attention in a way that an independent story wouldn't. Audience is emotionally connected to the characters. Again, we love those characters, and again, this can be confirmed or subverted, which takes us to the next slide. Maleficent would actually be the great example of that, and I apologize, I should have broken this down in 2 slides, but Maleficent would have been a perfect example of that. You're taking a character that people have an emotional connection with, and you're subverting that expectation. You're giving a completely new point of view. The reason I didn't start with this example is it was written by the fantastic Linda Wolverton, but who's a very established filmmaker. This was developed within the studio system. This was something that they attached stars while they were developing, so it doesn't really apply to breaking into the industry, but this could have very well have been developed by an independent creator, as sort of is the case of Wicked. Now, I didn't use this example because the original story came in literary form and not in film form, and I wanted something that had started in film, the new version. But the novel, Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, was exactly that, taking a story we know, relying on the information we already have, relying on the emotional connection we have, and let's subvert it now, initially in literary status. And this was very much a novel that broke, I'm blanking on the name of the writer, Timothy McGuire, I think, who wrote the novel, and that was his, he had already written a novel, but this was his breakout hit in the industry that led to all the other projects that were done since then. And I should say, this doesn't guarantee you, immediate access. Snow White and the Huntsman was written, I think the first final draft was written in 2003. The film was made in 2012. So it's not to say that Evan, had immediately sold that script for $3.2 million, but he still made it, and the project was still a huge film, and there was still a career after that. So that doesn't negate any of the aspects we've discussed so far. That can be done in a more playful way. Again, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters, a Rambo film for Hansel and Gretel. But sure, it works. It's a different way to approach the story that had different elements. You can do Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And you can also do something a little more subtle. Austen Land and Shakespeare in Love. Now, somebody might say, Bruno, these are actually, they were based on factual elements. Yes, but they relied on the characters having a connection to pieces of copyright-protected work, otherwise copyright-protected work that was now in the public domain. So when they made Austen Land with Kerry Russell, they could say, you know what, we'll quote from Jane Austen's work. We'll have reenactments. We'll have a number of elements that will add value to when we're pitching this story to fans of Jane Austen. And the same thing with Shakespeare in Love. We'll create this story, but in the beginning of the film, we'll have a segment with Romeo and Juliet. Then we'll have a segment with Othello. Then we'll have a segment with The Tempest. And that will add all the other benefits that we've discussed so far. That will add the texture. That will add the economy. That will add the emotional connection. If Shakespeare is doubting whether he's talented or not, we know the answer to that question. Whether it's factually accurate or not, in that reality, we know that that person is Shakespearean, and we know what the result is going to be. If Romeo and Juliet isn't working as a play yet, we know that it ultimately will, and so on and so forth. All clear on those elements? And actually, I was going to stop. The important thing here is, this is going to be my motivational moment of the lecture. It's about finding your idea and how this fits into this specific framework that I've presented. It's not about saying, well, now I need to find, I need to work with Snow White and find a way to do that. But do look at opportunities that are out there with these fictional works that might interest you, whether it's, again, one of the stories we've talked about, or the thousands of other stories that are out there that are in the public domain. They can add value to your specific work. If anybody is of an international background, these can be stories that might not be known by us in the Canadian or North American marketplace, but that still have a built-in audience that you can explore. So all those things add value to your pitch, because producers, buyers, know that they will go to AFM, that they will go to EFM, that they will go to the markets, and they will have to pitch these stories in a specific way. So if you're giving them ammunition, you're immediately a better buy than your competition that's trying to sell them a story that doesn't have those elements attached to it. So that's immensely important, and also highlight that in your pitches. Make sure that it's clear not only when the person's read your 120-page script, but when they receive the pitch material. So thank you very much. We can go to the next one. Cool. This is going to be the later chapter of what we're going to discuss, and I wanted to play a video. This is a video that was created by a then unknown filmmaker called Morgan Cooper. He uploaded this onto YouTube, and he posed the question, what would happen if Will Smith made The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air today? Bel-Air, a story of a kid from Philly whose life got turned upside down in 2019. Before we go, there is some violent content. This was put on YouTube, so it's something that, fairly acceptable by YouTube standards. But if anybody doesn't feel comfortable, there are some scenes of violence in this. So I just wanted to warn this, but whenever you're ready, if you want to play the video. First one there? Yes. Yes. You can see what he did with the rings and everything.
This is where YouTube gets you. I just got engaged when I was in Indonesia, so that's...
So you see? So that's the next lecture. We'll talk about target marketing.
They knew I was looking at rings. So.
For some reason you think this is a game. This is not a game, Will. Look at you. Look at you. The only reason why you're not in jail is because Uncle Phil caught in a favor.
Take your time. Don't think. So easy. You throw this? You stupid.
You are carrying a gun on the streets to protect yourself? I've done my best, Will. It's time for a change. You're going to Bel Air to live with your uncle and your auntie.
Bel Air, out of all places.
This is a second chance, Will. Don't waste it.
Will, I will not bail you out again. In this house, I'm not Uncle Phil. I'm the law. Have I made myself absolutely clear? Yeah. Yeah. There are no butlers to clean up your messes. You've got to be responsible for yourself.
So, Will, what brings you to Bel Air?
I caught with a gun. How are we related again? He's from the streets of Philadelphia. Will needs discipline.
Just a little time. Just a little time and a little love. We are what he needs.
Why don't you go back to Philly? Born and raised, right? You think I would ever want to be in this life? You're not welcome, Will. This is fake. Wherever you're from. This is fake. You didn't do anything to earn this. I never had nothing.
My life ain't a sitcom out there. I don't even feel like I belong here.
Just give it some time. Everything happens for a reason.
Yo, you must be from Philly.
Yeah. What's up, man? I'm Will.
Jazz.
Jazz.
Hey, so what part of town you staying in? Philly. They got you out there.
All right, Philly. Let's see what you got.
Well, welcome to Bel Air Academy.
I just made the team.
I'm so proud of you.
I'm so glad you're here. I need to take you shopping. Rodeo Drive. Oh my gosh.
I was telling my dog to be crazy. They say my birth is a curse, it's still made. I spilled it out in the field when it was raining. 10 toes down in it, Yanni came up strong with a will to live. Daddy never came home, mama never came. So it's better kids, got enough of the devil did. Streets ain't safe, that's what we're playing in. It's like deja vu, see you outside. It's like deja vu, see you outside.
Hey, Jazz. Hey, Prince. You can go there? Nah.
Okay, so first off, phenomenal work by Morgan Cooper who made this. A little bit of context for those who might not know. As a result of this, he had a meeting with Will Smith. They started developing this as a TV show. They sold this TV show to Peacock with a 2-season commitment. He became an initially co-executive producer, if I'm not mistaken, then executive producer of a show with a 2-season commitment, which is for you know, a brand new streamer that was pouring a lot of money into it and completely changed his career. So that is partially the reason why I wanted to use this example. Second thing, he relied on fair use, which is to say he did not have any authorization to tell the story. This was not a trailer of a film that was actually going to come out. He relied on the idea that I'm going to use this even though I have no copyright authorization to do so. What is fair use? And in Canada, fair dealing, but we're going to talk about fair use. Fair use is an exception to copyright protection. It basically poses the question, there are certain situations in which it should be fair to use something that is protected by copyright. How are they going to answer this question of what is fair? There are basically 4 factors. We could spend 3 hours just on this, but in a nutshell, the 4 factors are the character and purpose of the use, and I'll give you a brief explanation. The character and purpose of the use, the nature of the work, the amount and substantiality, and the effect upon the market for or value of. The character and purpose, basically, did you create something with a new purpose? Was it transformative, particularly to a degree of one of the protected purposes? That would be education, commentary, and parody, and other protected purposes in this field. The second, nature of the work. Is the original work very creative? If so, it's highly protected by copyright, and as a result, less eligible for fair use. If it's more factual in nature, it's less eligible for, it's less protected by copyright and therefore more eligible for fair use. Amount and substantiality. I know this is the most boring part, but I'll get through it rather quickly. Amount and substantiality. I'm sure people have heard that as long as you only use 10 seconds of a song in a film, you're okay. That is completely incorrect. What exists is a factor that is taken into consideration. The less you use, the better. And that is the idea of the amount and substantiality. If you've used only what is necessary to make your point. And last but not least, the effect upon the market for or value of. Did you diminish the value? Did you hurt the value or the demand for the original work that you borrowed from? And Morgan Cooper relied on those elements. He made something that was clearly transformative. It was making a commentary on society. He was using this to make that commentary. He kept it short in the sense that he wasn't making money off it. He didn't monetize it at all, which adds to his argument. The amount that he used was minimal. It certainly didn't hurt the value of the original. Was it a slam dunk in terms of not having risk? No. Fair use always has a risk factor. The idea that you can rely on fair use and not have risk attached to it is unreasonable. There will always be a risk factor, but he did everything he could. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you so much. And the other reasons why I like this is, first, it's logistically feasible. Now, Morgan Cooper, I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing. He did a phenomenal job with that video. But when you look at it, it's not like Avatar. It's not something that you're like, I have no idea how to make that happen. I would need another $50 million to be able to do that. He shot it fantastically well. He edited it very well. He found good actors, particularly given that he had no budget to speak of for this. So again, phenomenal work, but it is something within your reach. I'm not showing you something that you look at and say, well, I can't do that without, a huge amount of resources, particularly if you think of the length of each of those shots. Remember, that isn't an actual trailer. There isn't longer footage, well, at least not substantially longer footage, which means if you're making a trailer, you need very little time in that mansion because you're getting, however many shots you're getting in that mansion. You need very few shots in a specific gym because you need a total of 10 seconds for your trailer. The scene in the park, are you going to get all the permits and everything else? You should, but even if you don't, you're going to be shooting there for very little amount of time, and therefore you might not have relied on everything. You might not have gotten all the rights. So it makes it logistically feasible to do, and that's a very important point. And the artistic achievements accurately assumes audiences' knowledge of the original storyline. Now, that's essential. They're not really telling a story with this trailer, but Morgan Cooper is doing so in a genius way. He knows you already know the story, so he's not that concerned about being clear about, what's happening. The mother can start out by saying, what did you do? And then you explain what happened. The audience isn't going to get confused because they know this is the trailer for Bel Air, and they've heard that opening sequence from the original show 200 times, so they know what the story is, and they're not going to get confused. So he correctly relied on information the audience already had. He relied on the existing emotional bond with characters. The moment you see Carlton for 2 seconds, you're like, oh my God, it's Carlton. When you hear the mother saying you're moving with your auntie and uncle in Bel Air, you immediately have an emotional reaction because you've, maybe not everybody, but those of us who did, you've watched that sitcom as a child and throughout your life, and you have an emotional connection when you hear that actor delivering that scene. When you hear Uncle Phil saying, I am the law. All those things elicit an emotional reaction. And again, not because this wasn't fantastically well done, but because you can't do that in a trailer. You couldn't create that level of emotional connection, even if you are a genius. What you can do is tap into an existing emotional connection. Because I saw Uncle Phil doing that 20 years ago, I now have an emotional reaction when I see new footage of a new actor delivering it in a new environment, but keeping the essential points of the original story. Intentionally and effectively subverts plays with expectations. Now, clearly, that's the park scene mainly. There are other elements, but the park scene, if you've seen the opening sequence of the original Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, you're expecting, you know, it's Will Smith pretending to get in a fight, and then the police officer shows up. Everything is innocuous. There isn't a sense of fear. There isn't a sense of danger. Obviously, the filmmaker, and when I say obviously, with clear intent, made something completely different. That was the commentary he was bringing in, but he was subverting expectations. He didn't start with that scene. He started with something that hinted that this was going to be darker. He hinted with, you know, the actress delivering the lines about what Will got into trouble, but he doesn't actually show it. He waits till we feel like we're watching The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and then he hits us with that very impactful scene, because he knows that's going to be 10 times more impactful if we're already playing the opening sequence of the show in our minds, because now we're seeing, you know, bright colors, you know, a nice little beat, Will Smith, the original star, rapping to the lyrics, and now we're in that mood, and suddenly we're hit with a ton of bricks with the imagery that he, again, very astutely, very artistically created for this show. Does that make sense? Cool. Intentionally, yeah. I think that's what I had to say about this slide. Go to the next one. Other notable examples. I don't know if anybody watched Master of None. Aziz Ansari had a show on Netflix, has a show on Netflix. In season 1, episode 4, it opens with, it's not autobiographical, but it's inspired by elements of Mr. Ansari's life. And in this episode 4, there's a child version of him. There's a 8, 9-year-old character version of his character watching television in what is, you know, 90s, early 90s, late 80s. And it's an old-timey TV. Each time he changes the channel, you have that sound of the dial changing the channel. And every image he sees is a depiction of South Asian Indian culture, stereotypically depicted. It's Apu from The Simpsons, it's Mike Myers in The Guru of Love, and a number of others. And all we see for maybe 1-2 minutes is the child watching TV, changing the channel, and going to another channel in which you have that specific depiction. And he does that using actual footage. He didn't create a fake episode of The Simpsons. He used 5 seconds of, you know, The Simpsons, 5 seconds of Short Circuit, in which a Caucasian actor plays a South Asian character, and so on and so forth. And he explores all these. Now, that is 10 times more impactful than an independent creation, because what you're doing, essentially, is we know that's true. We know that that is much more impactful because we know that that was actually shown on television. And that was shown on television while that child, obviously that child is a fictional child, but while the creator of that child, the artistic creator of that child, was actually watching television. So there's a huge impact. And if you were to create a fictional story and include that in those little 3-5 second clips, it would lose a huge portion of its punch, a huge portion of its impact, because now we're seeing something that we know really didn't happen. Parodies on shows like South Park, Family Guy, The Simpsons, all of these rely on the concept of fair use. And I wish we could go on for an hour, but in a very, you know, short and objective manner. Parody is when you take, particularly for U.S. law, is when which is relevant particularly because of YouTube and all the other platforms that you might be uploading your content to, particularly this short form content. Parody is when you take a pre-existing work and produce a new work that is commenting, critiquing that work. So there's we customarily think of parody as humorous. That is not true. And an example I wanted to use, there's an incredible book by Alice Randall. Alice Randall wrote a book called The Wind Done Gone, which is a retelling of Gone with the Wind from the perspective of a black character. So it's retelling the main story beats of that story, and that is a parody, and I by no means am implying that it's a humorous story. What I am implying is it's taking a story, creating a new work that retells that original story from a different perspective. There's also a retelling of Lolita called Lo's Diary by Pia Pero, which is also, well, I shouldn't say it's a parody because there was a legal discussion and they settled the case, but there are arguments to say that both of those are parodies, relevant arguments to say that. And the last example I wanted to use, because I was looking at, I didn't want to use an actual piece of social media content that somebody was exploiting, and I wanted to use something that was an example of something that creative minds could apply to parody and use on social media. If we could play that last video, particularly, actually, before you do, I'll fit in an explanation while you prep the video. There's a song by the Beastie Boys called Girls. It's a song that has very problematic lyrics, particularly in hindsight. And a company called Goldie Blocks made a new version of that song for a commercial. Now, anywhere near it, it doesn't need to be exact. But quick show of hands, who is familiar with this song? Okay, a few of you. So I, for obvious reasons, won't play the original song, but you'll be able to tell what this new version is doing, and I'll explain in a moment. Go right ahead. So the reason I wanted to play this is they used this song that had very problematic lyrics and made a song about girls in STEM, girls in exploring these scientific entrepreneurs. And we could have played endeavors. We could have played the whole thing. But the idea is this was a slightly legally challenging case because it was a commercial, and basically when you're using parodies for commercials, they have less, there's what the courts say, less indulgence with parodies. Parodies are less effective. But if this were a creative video by a filmmaker trying to break in, that would be at least would have strong elements of what could be considered a parody. And it's taking something that is very well known. The original song was a very successful song, is a very successful song, and subverting it with a new messaging. Although this is a big, relatively high budget commercial, it's also the production value is something that could be done by a filmmaker without a lot of resources. You can plan this with set design, and we're talking about something that got 10 million views on YouTube, and smaller segments on TikTok and so on and so forth is where we're really looking for filmmakers out there, and is really the field to be exploited right now. I think, is that my last slide? I think it is. Okay, so quick comment. This obviously is a snapshot of some of the possibilities that can be explored. Look out for other forms of IP. Look out for books that might be available that aren't huge hits. Filmmakers can option works that are available out there. You can look at content creators online that might not have your filmmaking expertise, but have an interesting project. We were developing a project with an influencer that makes scenes with action figures, but has 25 million followers, and there was a deal that was just made regarding a production of a specific show under that banner. There's a lot of IP out there that you can acquire through the means that I've described during this lecture, but through other ways. And there's a tendency to think that this is only valid from a business perspective. What I wanted to do here, and whether I achieved the result or failed is a separate argument, but this has storytelling benefits. You can improve your storytelling. You can be more effective with your storytelling by using these tools, and that's really what I want you to take away. The business side is secondary. The achievement of making your script, your short film, your feature film better by using these resources is really what I wanted you guys to take away. So thank you so much, and it was a pleasure talking to you guys.
Thank you, Bruno. That concludes all of our sessions for the day. So we've gone through a lot of stuff today, 4 sessions with a lot of content and a lot of different topics here that hopefully you will walk away from this and realize that there's a lot of things to think about in film production, but hopefully a little bit more excited about doing some of these things and getting to know all the ins and outs of furthering your productions and things that you can do to make things even better than they are. So just a few little housekeeping reminders for everybody with everything. The gala film tonight is at 7:30, right over there, right across the bridge there. If you happen to be going over to that and you've parked down here, parking in Oakville after 6 p.m. is free. Okay, so you can move your car up to another lot up there, whatever, park on the street. After 6 p.m., it's always free. So you don't have to worry about that going into a municipal lot or anything like that. So, don't worry for that. We're going to have our dinner will be roughly around 5-ish, maybe 5:15, depending on how things all go. But you are free to hang out. Keep using those refreshment tickets. Everybody's taken good advantage, I can see, of the refreshment tickets there. I've seen beer and wine and some mixed drinks and stuff all over the place here. That's good. So we will have our dinner then. You can use you can sit in here. You can go outside and enjoy the weather. Walk around if you want to. Spend your time getting to know each other. Because I think a lot of you in here are basically, I think a lot of you are a lot of the short film directors and stuff that are in here. So get to know each other and talk, because honestly, this is how you meet people, and this is how you get to work with people, is the ones that you meet here. You'd be surprised the number of times I have met people at festivals that I have ended up working with. I mentioned earlier about going to Holly Shorts. I met a composer there. I've used him 3 times. And he's right off of Hollywood Boulevard in LA is where he works out of. And 3 times I've used him for 2 shorts and a feature film. And that was just from discussions, being at a festival and working with him. So take advantage of that sort of thing. Get to know each other and what strengths, and maybe you'll team up with people, and who knows where you'll go from now. But hopefully, it's a pretty young crowd in here. I feel really old in this crowd here, but keep at it. Keep at everything you're doing, and hopefully we'll see some big things from everybody in this room in the future. So, anyways, thank you very much for attending today, and enjoy the weather and enjoy the food that we're going to have later on. Yeah. And Judah.
Thank you.
Drop the mic.
Did we even have to fake leaves, I'm pretty sure, because we were shooting the stuff outside Patty's place?
That's right.
So we had literally everything.
Yeah.